It sounds like you're saying that there is some truth to the idea that there is a relationship between affecting the brain and then the experience of the person. Like alcohol would be a great example. I think we can think of a lot of other substances that
Uh,
impact the brain and therefore the experience of the person. But it sounds like what you're saying is that then there's sort of like a jump being made from there to then say that everything uh, in terms of consciousness and what we would commonly call like the human experience, the sense of self, the soul, the however you want to put it, the mind is all explained by the brain. It sounds like that's where the jump is coming in.
yeah. I mean, an analogy to that is that if one didn't understand much about telephones or about human beings, and you notice that when you're talking to your wife on the phone, that if the phone doesn't work so well, you can't hear your wife's voice, and concluding from that that your wife lives inside the phone. I mean, that there are
Hmm.
subtleties to that interaction that you have to be a little careful about. You can't jump to conclusions that aren't really supported by the evidence. The conclusion that all of the mind comes from the brain is actually a very radical claim. And there simply isn't any evidence for it in neuroscience. In fact, the evidence points in quite the opposite direction. Um, the first person, and I should say, the ancient philosophers, the brilliant people, Plato, Aristotle, Saint Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Saint Bonaventure, they all knew this just from logic. That is, you don't need neuroscience to know that there are aspects of the mind, specifically abstract thought, that don't come from the brain. Plato knew that.
Hmm.
But there's modern neuroscience that really backs that up, that really tells us the same thing that the ancient philosophers were telling us. Um, the first really clear example of this, I think, was in Wilder Penfield's work. And we mentioned Penfield earlier as a neurosurgeon and neuroscientist who worked in the mid 20th century. Began as a materialist. His initial viewpoint was that the brain explained the mind completely. And he became a dualist and believed in the soul as his career went on, because he said, well, no, the brain does not explain the mind completely. There are things in the mind that the brain doesn't explain. And his first piece of evidence for that was he was very interested in studying seizures. And there are some kinds of seizures in which you remain conscious while you're having the seizure. They're called partial complex seizures. And those kind of seizures, Penfield studied in great detail. And what he found was that when people have those kinds of seizures, they have one or more of four different things happen to them. The seizure will activate a part of the brain and make it work uncontrollably. It can make you move a limb, where you shake a limb. It can make you have a perception, like see a flash of light or hear a sound or have a smell. It can make you have a memory. There are some seizures where people will get memories. You'll get a memory of when you were a child in the kitchen, your mother was making dinner. Or you can have an emotion. There are some seizures that present as very intense emotions. But Penfield said, it's funny. Seizures never cause abstract thought. That is, and the term he uses is there are no mind seizures. By mind seizures, he meant intellectual seizures. So
Hmm.
why don't people occasionally have a seizure where they can't stop doing arithmetic, or have a seizure where they can't stop thinking about logic, or they'll do something like what we're doing right here, like who will start talking about mind-brain relationships. But that kind of thing never ever shows up in a seizure. The only things that happen in seizures are movement, perception, memory, and emotion.
Hmm.
Never abstract thought, never reasoning, never having concepts, never having free will. So Penfield said, that's awfully strange, because we spend most of our waking hours thinking abstractly. Why doesn't
Hmm.
that ever show up when the brain gets stimulated by a seizure? And he said, well, the simplest and most obvious explanation for that is that that kind of thinking doesn't come from the brain. That's why it's never elicited by a seizure. So, and I have had the same experience. I've done some research on the typology of seizures. I've estimated over the past 200 years, which is the length of time that neuroscience has been seriously studying the brain, there probably have been 250 million seizures that have happened in people throughout the world. Some of them have been reported in the medical literature, and there's not a single report in the medical literature that I'm aware of a seizure having any abstract intellectual content.
Hmm.
And that's rather remarkable, actually. And it amazed Penfield, and it amazes me. So Penfield did more work on this. Penfield pioneered in the awake brain surgery that I had talked about a while back, where you do surgery on people while they're awake, using local anesthesia so that they don't feel pain. The brain itself doesn't have any sensation of pain, doesn't have any sensations at all. And Penfield would do it to map the surface of the brain. So he could determine where the seizure was coming from and remove the part of the brain that was causing the seizure and cure the patient's seizures. In doing so, he generated these elaborate maps of like where the motor areas of the brain are, the speech areas, the sensory areas. And he performed, I've estimated, just back of an envelope kind of estimation, a little over 1 million different individual stimulations in his like 40 or 45-year career. He operated on 1,100 patients and did hundreds of stimulations on each patient. And he found the same thing on his patients that he found in the seizures, that no matter where he stimulated the brain, he could never stimulate an abstract thought. He could never stimulate a spot and the patient would say, oh, 1 + 1 is 2. Or, oh, gee, if A, then B, A, therefore B. Or love is kind. None of this abstract kind of stuff that we think of all the time, he could never stimulate. And the only 4 things he could stimulate were the same 4 things that seizures stimulate: movement, perception, memory, and emotion. So he said, well, maybe those thoughts don't come from the brain. Now, that doesn't mean that the brain is not necessary for the normal expression of those thoughts. I mean, if you get hit on the head with a bat, you're probably not going to be able to do a lot of arithmetic for a while. But that doesn't mean that the thought comes from the brain. It means that the brain is necessary for the elaboration of abstract thought, but not sufficient for it. So Penfield ended his career as a dualist. He says, the soul exists. And what comprises the soul, or he called the mind, but he really meant what we call the soul, is this capacity for abstract thought, capacity for reflection, for reason, for concepts, for free will, the very things that we think that make us human. And Penfield said, well, the brain does not explain the mind completely, and neuroscience points clearly to the existence of the soul. He wrote a book called Mystery of the Mind, which he details all of this. I highly recommend it if listeners are interested. And in my experience has really been the same.